Welcome to the Quality of Mind podcast, where you can explore the pioneering and game-changing understanding that unlocks the secret source to more productivity, peace, and potential. If you're fed up with the conventional echo chamber to personal development and human potential, and if you want to be part of the new breeders of leaders and entrepreneurs, come and explore the four psychology approach, enabling sustainable, wide-ranging transformation in every aspect of life and work, for exponential, not just marginal gains. Get ready to listen fresh and discover your secret source. Hello and welcome to the Quality of Mind Transforming Business podcast series. And today's episode, another lovely conversation lined up, this time with fellow coach of many years, Tim, who will introduce himself in a moment. And Tim and I have been on each other's radars for a little while, but we started dialoguing in the last 6 months, and I suggested that Tim might want to come on the show and talk about a topic that I think is probably very dear to our hearts and that of many other people, and that is flow. But we'll get into that in a moment. First of all, Tim, welcome to the show. And can you tell listeners just a little bit about you and a very potted history of what you are and what you do?
Yes, good to reconnect, Piers. I'm Tim Downs. I'm an executive coach, and I guide people through a program that I call the True Results Program. And if you look at my career, really, you can cut it in two, and it really changed at the turn of the century, around about the same time that you started full-time coaching. I started full-time coaching in a business called Marshall's PLC, where I was an executive performance coach. And I did that for about 2.5 years before moving on. I decided to fly solo, which transformed into True Results Limited. I've been doing that ever since, working with executives all over the world. That's me, really.
So a couple of decades at least of coaching experience, which is wonderful. I look at that myself, and I think in a modern growing profession, there are less people who have had sort of 15 years plus. So it's nice to speak to you on this, Tim. And if people want to know more about Tim's background, actually, there's a really nice podcast you did with another friend of ours, Phil Goddard, which we can put in the show notes. But just say a little bit about what's been happening for you over the last, I guess, 2 or 3 years. I'm not quite sure on the timing, and how come what we've been connecting on, and obviously, my change 10, 15 years ago to before psychology. Just say a little bit about that for listeners, if you can, in a summary way.
Yeah, my learning and development journey is I suppose it's my hobby as well as my profession. And like you, I was very interested in things like NLP at first, spent some time diving into deep things 20 years ago, and got into things like effective mindfulness working. And from there, about 6 years ago, I dived deep into these 3 principles by a guy called Sydney Banks, and that, like a lot of people, led from that into what you're calling quality of mind before psychology. I've just been more and more fascinated by this study of quality of mind, and reading a lot of books like Salpo. I'm reading at the moment Liberation Is, and the 3 books by Kat, who's quite a regular on this podcast.
So, as well as the sort of chronologically and the people you've found interesting, just say a little bit about what you think it brings to the coaching, what it brings to transformation, to the human being, to your work. What do you think is available now that you're looking more in this direction than where you have been for the previous 20 years?
I think it's almost, even if you just take the word flow, it's that shift from like a mindful approach to wanting to be in the present, to actually seeing that the present, the now, flow itself is actually what we are, and that we're being lived by life rather than trying to control life. That side absolutely fascinates me.
Right. Yes. It's a sort of move from trying to do it to just seeing it's there, a reveal rather than a do. Yeah, I would
Yeah.
echo that. So, okay, let's get into this topic of flow. And regular listeners will be very familiar with what that means, but let's just, for people who maybe not quite sure what we mean by flow, or just so we got some consistency, just say what we mean when we're talking about flow. So what we might be pointing to with flow, without getting into the ins and outs of it, just what is it? If someone said to you on a bus, well, what's flow then? What would be your sort of 20-second answer?
Well, my sort of 5 seconds answer would be that flow is the zone of presence in motion, but just talking to somebody on a bus and saying those words might not be helpful. Or it's like it's that experience of dancing as if there's no one watching. And it's an experience that I've most experienced when I would write my novel, and it was like the novel just came through me and spilled onto the page. And I think a lot of people would talk about expressions like "in the zone,"
Yeah.
which is why I use that expression, because at least people are familiar with that.
Yeah.
If you go back a few years, that it wasn't used that much. And it's, if you take somebody like Ayrton Senna, the great motor racing driver, his connection to flow was through a connection with God. And he was, if you watch the documentary, it's just incredible how incredibly present he was when he was driving, and how aware he was.
I think, yeah, I like some of your descriptions there, Tim, and I think it's one of the most ordinary things there is. And whoever we are, we've all experienced it, and probably today, right? Even for 1 or 2 seconds. So I think it's those moments of our day when we're just in life. So whether that's we're cooking, or we're talking to a friend, or something's just coming off our fingers onto our keyboards, we're tapping an email, or we're just walking and we just capture a bird or a daisy or a sunset, or doesn't matter at all what it's about, or just anything. It's just those moments when there's just an ease, a beauty, an aliveness, a potential in what we're doing. Now, of course, in sport, it often gets called, as you said, in the zone. So sport people say, "Oh, I was really in the zone," and they try to get the team into the zone. Often in the creative arts, music, singing, it's sort of the flow word. But I think for business folk that you and I work with, if you look at your average day or week, there'll be times when there's just an effortless productivity, inspiration, creativity, ease, and there'll be times when there won't be. And it's a question I often ask groups when I first start working with them. Once I've defined it a little bit, we've had a little experience of it, I say, well, roughly what percentage of your week would you spend in flow? And the answers, well, I mean, you can probably guess the answer I'm going to say, Tim. It's sort of well below 20, 15, 10%. People go, oh, 5% if I'm lucky, So one of the questions I find fascinating is, how come we don't spend more of our time in flow? Because young kids, 1, 2, 3-year-olds, spend they'd be up at the sort of 80% mark. So what I want to explore on this podcast, Tim, is really starting with the question, how come we don't spend more of our time in flow, and what can we see about that? I didn't say the word do, because some people might think that, but what can we see about that? So would you be sort of similar in thinking that most people don't spend very much of their week in flow that they're aware of?
The majority of people, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So how come you think that's the case?
I mean, I think part of the point is that we're always in the present.
Mm.
We're never anywhere else.
Mm.
What people think of as the present is when they're just totally in this hyper-focused state of flow. And what gets in the way of that is the self and the thinking of the self. So we're effectively getting in our own way.
Yeah. And just as we'll come back to, I want to just come back to the self, obviously, in a moment. But you mentioned the phrase there, hyper focused, because I'm not sure I would. Well, it depends what you mean by hyper. So, what do you mean by hyper focus? Because I'm not sure I agree that's what flow is for me. So, when you say hyper focus, what do you mean?
Focused in totality on that one thing that one's doing, whether it's the dance or the motor racing, driving, or the creativity or the singing, whatever it is.
Yeah. But would it be fair to say that, and actually the word flow points to this, doesn't it, can change in a second?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not, because some people I think hyper focus means being able to do a piece of work for 2 hours and never be distracted, never have a thought about breakfast or lunch, and just be totally almost to the exclusion, total dedicated, almost narrow focus. And that's not what you're saying, is it, with hyper focus? What you're saying is just being so present to what is going on in that moment, however long that moment is, 1 second or 5 minutes. There's nothing else there.
Yeah, I mean, you just made me think of a client who was so focused on a report at work that when their daughter bought them a special card, and was a small daughter and was trying to pass them the card, didn't even see them. So I see flow as being linked to being aware. In fact, I believe in the book, The Complete Book of Awakening, they actually call flow awareness in motion.
Yeah.
And so I think I can see what you mean. And that's why I sort of, when we had this discussion about flow, I came up with a little thing called the 3 phases of flow, which I now share with clients. So the first phase would be intent. And that, if you look at Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's book, Flow, he very much talks about getting into flow through an intent, through passion, through purpose, through a goal. And there's an almost I think it's how you were seeing hyper-focused, an almost hyper-focused push towards flow, whereas a more meditative, Zen-like, mindful way into flow, or maybe linked to some sort of universal intelligence or God, like Ayrton Senna that was saying, is to flow with ease. So I see those 2 levels, and so there's intent, ease, and then the 3rd level is when we actually start to see that there is no self, and that gets out of the way of what we're doing, and at that point we move into aware. Salpo in his book very much just calls it aware. He doesn't call it awareness. He just makes it really simple and just says aware. And I see those as the 3 sort of phases of flow, and they're all efficient and effective.
Well, you see, where I struggle with that is, to me, intent is the opposite of flow, right? So, and this is where words get a little tricky, because as we've talked about on this podcast in very many ways in different episodes, and what's at the heart of, I guess, before psychology is there is no free will, right? Not to anything outside of the system, consciousness, maybe you want to call it. So the idea of intent seems to be what you would do when you're out of flow, right? because in flow, there's no intent. There may be what we might retrospectively call intent. Oh, when I was in flow, there was a real intent for me to go around the corner really fast if you're Ayrton Senna, or to do the long ball over to Harry Kane if you're, Foden or something in football, right? So I'm not saying there wouldn't have been the appearance of a me with intent within flow. But it's not like you can get into flow via intent, really. I mean, you might think you can, but often when you're trying to get into flow, the last thing that will happen is flow, because you're trying to get into flow. And that's this going back to the self thing that's in the way of flow. So for me, I struggle with the idea of intent, because that to me seems like a property of the self. Now, apart from the appearance of, right? So tell me more about what I've misheard there with that intent piece.
No, I'm with you really, because when I read Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's book when I was on holiday, I was just quite surprised what he was talking about, because I didn't think it would be about goals and purpose. I thought it would be more the ease and aware.
Yeah.
But I put intent in because of, this guy's the godfather of flow, and he saw it, but I don't think he quite understood what it truly was from this perspective.
So before Psychology, Quality of Mind, this podcast, as regular listeners will know, we're all about direct experience. And direct experience, for those people that don't know what that means, is that you see what you see for yourself, right? It's irrelevant what someone's written in a book, even if they're world leading X or Y. I mean, there's lots of world leading scientists who say things that I completely disagree with. Just because they're world leading doesn't mean anything. So what it sounds like, Tim, but I'm obviously you need to say this, is that what you see about flow, and possibly see therefore for others, is there's no real phases. There's just this awareness, aware, and there's a movement within that aware of psychological objects, and there's no resistance from the self, or no self-identification to the self, and that's what flow is. So whereas we might want to break it down into 3 phases, I don't see how they can be, really.
Yeah, I think by phases, it probably isn't the right word when you say it that way. It was more that there's 3 ways of looking at it, and the intent comes from this. I've picked up from this famous book, and there are other people talk about purpose linked to flow, as if purpose will take us into this.
Right. Well, okay.
Place.
So let me just hear that again then. So let's say one thing I find it quite easy to get into flow about is my work. I'm very, 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 a bit like you probably. I've stumbled across this profession 24, 25 years ago, and I love what I do. It just feels the most obvious thing in the world to me to do, to chat to people about this stuff. And therefore someone could say, oh, Piers, you found your purpose, you found your intent, and therefore you're in flow about it. Yeah. And therefore, because you've got your purpose, because you've got your intent, you find it easy to be in flow. But if you had to do, I'm just on try and pick something, be a professional chef, right? And whereas I can boil an egg and knock up a stir fry, I would cooking is not my sort of forte. I would not be in flow if someone said, oh, can you knock up a meal for 10 people tonight, Piers? I wouldn't be in flow, because it's not my purpose, it's not my intent. So I think there is, and this is a really key word for me, there's a correlation, most certainly, between what we'd find it easier to be in this flow state on something that we have an intent for, purpose for. Is that another way of saying it?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So therefore, intent is not a way to get into flow, because if we put intent in, then we're not in flow. But it could be that we find it easier to experience flow on something we have a purpose or intent for, right?
And a passion, yeah.
And a passion might be a symptom of that. But if we go down, let's take something else. Let's take going for a run, right, or doing some exercise, because in that experience, people might find, I don't know, 30% of their run was just easy. There was no, they weren't thinking about the time or their legs hurting or the distance or are we there yet? Are we there yet? And another percentage of the run they did. So within the same activity, they could experience flow and not flow. So they can go, well, the last 2 miles just whizzed by, right? But miles 1 to 3 and miles 7, 8, and 9, oh my gosh, they were hard work. So you could, so the intent thing doesn't really work for me there because, you could say, well, my intent is to be an amazing runner or that's my purpose. But even within the same activity, you would notice flow coming and going, right? So I think the reason we correlate flow with intent and purpose, because it's more likely that someone who loves running is going to spend a higher percentage of their run in flow than someone that hates running, right? So I think that you could correlate that. But what's so fascinating isn't that it's anything to do with the running, it's to do with the self-identified mind within that activity, right? So if we stop looking at the red herrings and go back up, because you mentioned this earlier, I asked you the question, what gets in the way of flow? You said, well, actually, it's the self, right? So let's look at that, and then we'll come back and look at our 3 phases and see what we think about that. So when you say it's the self that gets in the way of flow, just say a bit more about that, on how you see that.
It's our belief that we are the mind, the ego, our identity, and the thoughts and the feelings that identity has, that gets in the way of this this flow of presence, and it's about being aware of that, and then beginning to see that what we are is that is aware.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would agree with that. I think when I sometimes try to put a meta understanding or summation of what I'm pointing people to with the 4 psychology and quality of mind, if you try and boil it down to the simplest but no simpler, as Einstein would say, to me, anytime we experience any lack of resourcefulness, suffering, lack of flow, it's down to one thing. And the one thing it's down to is a resistance to the isness. And isness is a fancy word of saying what's happening, just the very raw happening of the moment. Sensations, perceptions, thoughts, whatever. So whenever we're experiencing a lack of flow, it's down to one thing, which is a resistance to the isness. And the only thing that can make us have a resistance to the isness is a self-identification. So all lack of flow comes from resistance to the isness. All resistance comes from self-identification. Really simple. And in any moment, the system recognizes that, it goes back to flow. Now, what I mean by self-identification is what you just sort of hinted at, which is when we think that the appearance of a me is a separate entity, and there's me in a world, there's duality, there's like me looking at the world, there's me feeling my emotions, I am my body mind, I am this thing that is born and dies. That's a self-identification. When we believe in any moment it's happening to me, that I'm a thing that does the awareing. I am the body mind that does the awareing. I'm an entity, rather than just what I am is an appearance in the consciousness. So let me say that in simple language. The only one thing that can get in the way of flow is resistance to the isness. The only thing that can create resistance is a self-identification. When we believe we are separate, we believe we are an entity, we don't believe we are part of the system. And in any moment we spot that, and we the idea of us being a separate me, which we've been conditioned for years to think about, dissolves, we go back into flow. And therefore, the reason why it might correlate with purpose, because when we're in purpose, the self has no resistance to the idea of doing what we're doing, whether that be cooking, running, or driving a Formula One car or playing football or whatever. It has nowhere to get to. It's not trying to achieve anything. It's not seeking. It's not protecting. It's all things that the conditioned self does. And therefore experiences flow. So actually, at one level, to me, it's super simple. The question people might be asking when they're listening to this goes, okay, well, let's assume there's something in what you're saying. How do I stop self-identifying? How come I seem to self-identify as an adult way more than my 2-year-old who doesn't self-identify at all and therefore experiences flow? How come I, in certain things I do, I self-identify, and certain things I don't? And that comes back to this very prevalent, innocent, invisible misunderstanding that we've all been conditioned to have from the moment we were arrived in this so-called world, that we are separate, we are a self, and materialism and physicalism, and that the world is primary and consciousness comes from the world, and it's all stems from that. Now, I've just said quite a lot in the last 5 minutes, Tim. I'd love for you to comment on what you heard in that, and what makes sense to you, etc., or doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch a child, and we've just got a new great nephew in the family, and if you watch a small child in those first 18 months, they're just totally fearless. Certainly my other great nephew is, he's mountain climber of cabinets and everything. There's a fearlessness there. There's a joy of adventure. There's just something different at that point, and at that point they're not thinking about things out. This isn't Freddie's toy. It's just a toy. That identity hasn't been formed at that age, and there's a complete and utter freedom that those people, little people, experience at that age. And then along comes thought and thoughts of self and ego and the mind, and other words that we use to describe this self. I quite like Eckhart Tolle's phrase, the phantom self, because it gives away the illusionary nature of this self.
Yeah. And I think that's we're always asking people to see this for themselves rather than just take any ideas about it. And you can see it in children. Oh my gosh, you can see it in children. How when they're in the moment, there's a glint in their eye. You can feel it off them. They're just in that moment, they're in that flow, and there's no idea of a self. And as they get older, the self digs in and starts to appear. And what happens then is and it's going to do that because that's the human condition. But the mistake in our conditioning is that we don't flag that. We don't go, okay, it's going to appear like you are a separate self that needs to go in the world and make stuff happen. Don't worry about that, is what we should be telling our kids. That's just how it appears. What you truly are is something before that. And so there's almost like our conditioning then goes along with the tradition of, because it appears like this, and science sort of says it's like this, it must be this. And then this self gets, particularly in the last 50 years, gets deified on things like social media and in status and in needing things. And then the more we do that, the more we resist the isness, because when something isn't going our way, we haven't got what we think we need in terms of the right bank balance or the right job or the right achievement or the right friends or the right warmth or the right whatever it is, we resist the isness. So a simple way you can check this out, listeners, in your day is when you're feeling a little bit out of flow, which is probably from our statistics probably most of the day. Just notice where your psychology is at. And what I mean by that is, are you heading further into your psychology with your thinking, making meaning, and or what can I do about that? What's happening here? What am I heading further into my psychology, or am I going what I call back? Am I going back to see there's just the isness, there's just things coming and going, and what I truly am is a thing that's aware of that. So it's a simple question, and it obviously people need to know what it means for them. But in any moment, am I going further into my psychology, into the idea of being a separate self, into my meaning making, into my seeking, protecting, controlling, or am I coming back up out to see there's just the occurrence of thought, sensation, and perception happening, and the only consistent thing there is just the thing that's aware of that. And even just asking that question can just sometimes nudge people back out, right? And they just start to leave some of their thinking behind. Now, it will completely depend on your conditioning of what things rev you up and what don't. But it's that simple. And then because we then go through our day, don't we? Trying to find those ordinary miracles where you're just having a cup of tea, or you're just going for a little walk, or you're having a breath, where you experience that lack of the self-identification. And we think that comes from a thing like doing our yoga or going for the walk or whatever. No, that's just when the mind stops self-identifying, and we attribute it to the activity. So you can see this in your day, listeners. You can just spot it happening, pop. And the question I think we're suggesting people start to inquire into is, has that really come from the thing I did or the activity, or is it because actually my mind started coming back up out of the psychology? Anything you want to add? Or
I think that's where I'm coming. That reminds me of the model that I shared around intent on one side, and then this ease and aware on the other side. It's there's this effortless effort, this incredible ease when we get out of our own way and we see the illusion for what it is. It's a lot of people talk. One of the metaphors I use that I learned 20 years ago was about the metaphor of the sky and the clouds.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like and the waves is another popular one. It's a bit like putting on your James Bond rockets and shooting up to the cloud and putting your hand on the cloud, expecting your hand to touch this solid object, and it goes straight in because the cloud is there, but it's not what you think it is. It's an illusion. And that's where we are with this identity, this ego, this mind, this self, some say with a small s, that's it's there, but it's not what you think it is. And we need to see beyond the illusion of that.
And if someone's listening now thinking, okay, well, yeah, I probably could do with some more time in flow. What can I do? Like, if I was to generalize it, oversimplified way, there's two directions you can go. You can either go into the world of tools, techniques, habits, and rituals to find more flow, and you will probably find some, right? You can do your yoga, you can do your breathing, you can have your cold showers, you can do your mantras, you take time out, you can do all these things, and you probably will find you could increase your propensity for flow. But all of those things in my mind require, they are giving the self the job of trying to find it, this flow, right? Which we said is the opposite direction to look in. And they will be a little bit hit and miss, right? They won't always be consistently there to do it because they're the correlate, not the cause. And they actually can, for some people, busy their mind up because they're, wanting to get into flow. They're doing all these things that sort of get in the way of flow. So yeah. You could go that direction. And that's where what a lot of, if you went into a book shop and asked about flow, that's probably what you get some books on. Now, what we're pointing to might seem more abstract or not quite as easy, or well, what, I don't really get it, because we're talking about going the different direction to flow, which is to see that it's not something you do, it's something that is innate in what we are. And actually, it is the most innate, the innatist, that's even a word, most essential, fundamental thing that we are, which is why you see it in kids, little infants, because they don't have much more put on them yet. So if you strip us all back, any single one of us, doesn't matter how old, our gender, our ethnicity, our culture, our IQ or EQ, if you strip us back, we are all flow. That's all there is. Right?
Yeah.
So it is, when you get a new device or a new computer, it comes as default, right? It comes default, and then we start adding apps on and software on and all this kind of stuff. But if you just literally boot it up out of the packet, let's assume they haven't put too much bloatware on it. It's just the default system, and our default system is flow.
Yeah.
Then we try and accidentally get rid of that stuff that's added on to flow and get back to flow by adding more stuff on. It doesn't really make any sense. And it's a shame it partially works, actually, because I think if it didn't work at all, people wouldn't get hoodwinked by it. So what we're saying is, right, get to see what default is, strip the system back, which takes a second, right? We're not talking about psychologically diving around into your psychology. No, that's going further in. It takes 1 second for us to go back to this. And I've done the podcast on how you can do that if you want more details on that. But it's recognizing that. And then once you recognize, oh, that's what I am, it seems to be that the system recalibrates, if you like. And then the automated system, which is what it is really always, is more prevalently in flow. And that percentage we talked about, oh, it's probably 5% of my day, starts going up. 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50% of my day, my week, I'm more in this flow. The system has a beautiful recalibration. It's not a straight line linear graph, but there's definitely, because there'll be things that appear that we might want to, let's call it, explore. But that seems to be just one of the biggest design features of the system, is that if we look in this direction and we sort of wake up, to use a spiritual phrase, or recognize it, the system starts to recalibrate that way by itself.
Yeah, and it's probably the same even with the word mindful, isn't it? So people think mindfulness is something we do, even down to coloring books, when actually mindful is what we are.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's not an act. Sorry, what I mean an act. It's not a doing. It's, a lot of people will do things to try and get into a mindful state, as you say, coloring books or yoga or breathing or whatever. But you can just live in a mindful place. You don't need to do stuff to it. It's just, 1 and 2-year-olds spend the whole time there. They don't do any practices to get there.
Yeah.
The word mindful just doesn't make sense to me, because it's actually, it's not full at all. It's flow. It's mind flow, not mindful. So yeah, it's a funny word to use, isn't it? So I just want to go back, because I'm still a little curious, Tim. You're gonna have to work harder to help me out. I'm being a bit thick. I still don't get why there's phases of flow.
Well, I was looking to separate people who are in flow, let's say Messi playing football,
Yeah.
who hasn't actually awakened to see that there is no self. So that's the difference between aware and ease, that he would be in ease, and those that have awakened to see that there is no self have gone through that shift, that they see themselves for being aware. That's the difference between those two. We've already spoke quite a lot about.
So what's I don't see the value in knowing the difference between the two. Well, I do. I suppose I do at the level of if the person who's just in ease is just curious to know why they're not in ease in more of the things, right? So let's say Messi. Let's just make up Messi's life for a moment. He's beautifully at ease when he's got the football, but when he's making scrambled eggs, he's not, right?
Yeah.
Or when he's being a dad or something, right? If he wanted to go, how come I can, play in front of 100,000 people, but I can't cook an egg, in flow, it's because he doesn't really understand what flow state is. And what you're saying is, if he had more of an awakened awareness to that, he would know. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm saying that's the fundamental difference and why I came up with
So they're
this
doorways,
observation.
really. It's not doorways that we can open, but they're ways you might see it, or
Yeah, maybe I would say maybe the word phases
yeah,
isn't the right word. It's yeah, doorways sounds
yeah. Because
more
I always think phases are like when you're pregnant, you go through first trimester, second
yeah,
trimester, third trimester,
yeah,
and
yeah. I see what
um and there's a linearness to it. But that's not what you're saying at all. So let's simplify it even more, because you know me, I like simple. It's incredibly, as I said at the beginning, it's the most ordinary thing. Whereas we don't want to make it sound grand. It's the most extraordinary, ordinary thing. So I guarantee listeners, if you put this podcast down after you've finished listening, you will, in the next hour of your life, there'll be micro moments of flow if you start to look, right? Just tiny little tiny things. So it's in your everyday starting to spot this. It's not like I've got to wait till I play football again, or I've got to wait till I waken up to this stuff. No. It's getting an acuity to it, and just recognizing that it's there for all of us behind our thinking. You don't need to have found your purpose or your intent. You don't need to be awake to this at a fundamental level. If you are fundamentally awake to this, you will see it more, most definitely. I mean, that's obvious. That's why people come and work with us, isn't it? Because they want to go from the 10% to the 70% or whatever. But it's still there for us to see. It's still there for us to see. And then what we've innocently, invisibly done is accidentally created recipes for how to get there, which really complicate it and take us in the wrong direction. So if you were to try and summarize this, Tim, for someone, what would you say? How would you, let's say the person in the bus was interested in what you'd said in your, what would be if you had another minute of conversation to have with them, what would you say?
I think it comes over to actually inquiring within ourselves and asking some really simple questions, such as are we aware? And then just inquiring on that and pondering on that and beginning to ask questions like that. Are we present? And it's that path called inquiry that begins to open things up. Books like Seeing Yourself, the latest book by Kat, and that book Liberation Is by Sal Poe, I'm finding particularly helpful around this. You've got your Taste the Mango videos. I think it's that experiential side, because the mistake I've made in the past is trying to come from an understanding rather than an experience. And it's beginning to inquire about that and really begin to see that what we actually are is that aware rather than that conditioned, programmed self, this identity, this mind, this ego.
Yeah. And I think it's such an important point that you mentioned, that you can't really understand or think your way to seeing this about what we are, and a lot of us will try,
Yeah.
And you've got the t-shirt and done that, so have I. And when you do it like that, it doesn't look that simple. It looks quite hard work, and it looks a bit very, very elusive. But when you just experience it, and then the recognition appears that, oh yeah, that's always there. The penny kind of slightly drops, and there's always further for it to drop. But that's the fascinating bit, isn't it? So us innocently, even someone who's really, oh, I just want to experience more flow. I want more of this. I want, and they try very, very hard, and there'd be a good study, and they'd be a good at the tools and the techniques and the rituals and the practices. They'll have more flow in their life, but it won't be effortless flow. If you know what I mean? They have to sort of curate it and get into it. So I think there's a very, very important point about just seeing the simplicity of it experientially. So let me try and put a bow on this for listeners. So let's clear up some myths. Flow is not tied to a activity or thing. It's not like, oh, I can only have flow if I love what I'm doing. Not at all, right? Even if you don't like an activity, it's still possible to be in flow if you stop self-identifying and resisting. So it's not tied to a person or an activity. It's not tied to that. It's not something that only certain people have and certain people don't have. No, it's absolutely the most amazingly innate, essential thing about all and every single one of us. And we will never, ever, regardless to what life we've had, horrible life or good life, lose our capacity for it. So it is universal, consistent, and eternal for all of us. And the reason we're not in it more, to use that phrase, is because of this very fundamental yet simple misunderstanding that we believe we are this separate self that has to go into the world and seek and protect. And we are, a separate person rather than being part of the system, being consciousness, being aware, whatever you want to call it. And once we can see through some of those things, you just find and inquire into them in an experiential way, not in a thinky way, as you said at the end there, people will just find flows more available, and it's not a property of the outside world. I think that's what's so fascinating. It's available about anything for anyone in any moment, and it then has the richness of life coming through. So, Tim, any final thoughts you want to add on to that before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think it's, to pull some of those things together, it's, it's not being a seeker trying to understand something. It's the realization through inquiry that we are flow, that we are now, that we are aware, that we are present, that we are free. We're all out there seeking things like to be free, to have freedom. And the irony is that's what we are. It's all this conditioning and programming and thoughts and feelings and perceptions from this phantom self, this separate self, this ego, this mind that's getting in the way.
Yeah. And I think the final thing I'll say before thanking you for coming on is, listeners, if you've at some level resonated with what we've been saying, even if the words don't make sense or some of it, you're like, well, what do you mean by that? But if there's something behind that where you resonate with this and you want to know more about what Tim was just saying at the end there, reach out and have a conversation about this stuff, because it is not the easiest thing to conceptualize, put in a box or stick on the wall. But don't let that get in the way of some deeper level of resonance you might have with it. And my experience is that most people, when they can peel back a couple of layers of thinking, everyone resonates with this, because why wouldn't you? Because it's the most fundamental, essentially, thing about us, and the most useful thing for us to recognize. So that having been said, Tim, thank you so much for giving up some of your afternoon and coming on to the show. I know you'll be very open for people to contact you if they want to. So what's the best way for you to get hold of you if they were curious?
Simplest way is just to email me at tim@trueresults.co.uk.
Lovely. So, Tim, thank you so much. Thank you for coming on. And listeners, have fun being curious. Till next time.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast and want to know more, check out our website at qualityofmind.biz. And also feel free to reach out and leave us a review or a comment. Until next time, have fun being curious.